Hello, beloved. My name is Epaminondas, and for over 5 decades I served as an exorcist and pastor. I'm no man of fantasy or conspiracy. My life has always been rooted in the direct fight against the evil that inhabits the invisible. But now, at 72, I find myself facing a truth so dark that even I wouldn't believe it. Within the high echelons of the Catholic Church, there is a conspiracy as ancient as it is powerful. Hidden under the cloak of sanctity operates a secret society called Lux Obscura. These men, clad in ecclesiastical vestments and masked as guardians of the faith, serve not God, but an opposing purpose, to pave the way for the arrival of the Antichrist. At the center of this plot is the Black Pope, a real and influential figure who acts as a shadow of the true pontiff. His work is to undermine the foundations of Christianity, distort the doctrine, and plunge the world into chaos. Through wars, religious divisions, and manipulation of the masses, they are paving the way for the advent of the King of Darkness. I discovered all this too late. An exorcism, which seemed to be just another one among many, revealed secrets that should have remained buried. I was thrown into an investigation that led me to the heart of Rome, to the depths of the Vatican, and to the confines of my own faith. As I write these words, I see the signs of this prophecy's fulfillment. Conflicts like the war between Ukraine and Russia, attacks on the Holy Land of Israel, and the spiritual collapse that permeates the world. Everything is connected, like pieces of a dark puzzle. I leave this account as my final warning. Perhaps you won't believe me now. Perhaps you'll see this story as fiction, the insane theory of an old man. But when the trumpets sound and the Antichrist takes his place, you will remember me. And maybe, just maybe, these words can give you strength to resist. My story begins 5 years ago, on a warm October afternoon. I had just concluded my last official exorcism before retirement. The case was difficult, but routine. A middle-aged man, tormented by a malevolent presence. After hours of prayers and spiritual confrontations, the entity was expelled, leaving behind only the exhausted body of the victim. I thought it would be the end of my active work as an exorcist. Little did I know that this case would be the beginning of something much bigger and darker. Days later, while reviewing my library of theological studies, a letter arrived at my door. The envelope, of thick paper and sealed with wax, was addressed to me with no return address. I opened it with curiosity, but the contents left me intrigued and uneasy. Pastor Epaminondas, a shadow looms over the church. Within its most sacred walls, men who should protect the faith are working to destroy it. Trust no one who wears a clerical collar. Seek Lux Obscura and find the truth. Be careful, they are always watching. I was suspicious of the message's modification. After all, it wasn't uncommon to receive letters of a conspiratorial nature, often written by disturbed individuals. However, something about this letter stirred me. The name Lux Obscura was new to me. I decided to file it away, but it remained in my mind, like a thorn difficult to ignore. A few weeks later, an even more disturbing event shed light on the letter. During an exorcism in a small inland town, the possessed, a young man of about 20 years old, revealed the same name, Lux Obscura. His voice, distorted by the entity that dominated him, said, "They prepare the way. The Black Pope leads. All will fall." My experience taught me not to ignore repetition in spiritual situations. I was seized by a sense of urgency. Could it be possible that the words of that young man and the anonymous letter had some connection? From that moment on, I decided to investigate. In the following months, I began researching in libraries, ancient theological texts, and even in the accounts of the few exorcists with whom I kept in contact. But information about Lux Obscura was practically non-existent. It seemed that the name had been deliberately erased from historical records. It was then that an old friend in Rome, the investigative journalist Lorenzo Ferri, entered the scene. During a casual conversation, I mentioned my search, expecting him to laugh or dismiss the idea. Instead, Lorenzo was silent for a moment, then replied, "Epaminondas, you may be playing with fire. There are reports of something like this within the Vatican, but no one dares to speak. If what you seek is true, it's bigger than we imagine." Convinced that I would continue, I made a decision that would change my life, to travel to Rome, the heart of the mystery, and seek answers directly at the Vatican. From the moment I set foot in the Eternal City, I realized I was entering dangerous territory. Lorenzo introduced me to Irina, a librarian who had unrestricted access to the Vatican secret archives. She was skeptical, but seeing my determination, she decided to help me. In our first meetings, Irina confirmed what I already suspected. Within the Vatican, there were circles of power, where secrets were kept under lock and key. These circles were impenetrable, but occasionally whispered words were heard in the dark corridors. "Lux Obscura is one of them," Irina said once in a serious tone. "But if this is real, we're talking about something very ancient and dangerous." My investigation was only beginning, but fear already haunted my mind. I began to notice patterns in world events. The war between Russia and Ukraine, the attacks against Israel, the increase in disbelief and religious skepticism on a global scale. Everything seemed interconnected, like pieces of a dark puzzle. I knew I was on a one-way road. The anonymous letter, Lorenzo's words, the forbidden archives. Everything pointed to a secret buried in the center of the church itself. The fight I thought was against spiritual evil was revealing itself to be something much greater. A battle against forces that operated in both the visible and invisible worlds. It was the shadows of the Vatican that now called to me, and I knew I would not emerge unscathed from this journey. Upon arriving in Rome, I felt the weight of the city's past and present on my shoulders. The narrow streets and imposing cathedrals simply whispered stories of power and conspiracy. My first step was to find Lorenzo, who was waiting for me in a small cafe out of curious eyes. Lorenzo was a fearless journalist, famous for investigating topics considered dangerous. After listening to me attentively, he nodded and said, "You're not the first to touch on this subject, Epaminondas. I've heard murmurs about a secret society in the Vatican, but no one has proof. They control everything, and those who get close disappear. But if you want to continue, I know someone who can help." That's how I met Irina, a librarian who had worked in the Vatican archives for over a decade. When Lorenzo introduced us, she was direct. If Lux Obscura exists, they don't leave easy-to-locate traces. But there are rumors. They say there are meetings in secret locations, texts that never reach the eyes of those who don't belong to their circle. Are you prepared for what you might find? I was, and she knew it. Irina began to show me documents that even she accessed with difficulty. In one of these ancient files, we found mentions of a secret order called Lux Obscura. It was described as a group formed by members of the high hierarchy of the church, whose objective was to reinterpret the scriptures in order to prepare the world for a new time, a new world order. Among the coded words, one phrase caught my attention. Adventus Regis Tenebrarum, the arrival of the King of Darkness. As we investigated, Lorenzo began to connect the dots between what we discovered and current events. He presented reports of global conflicts and crisis policies that were too synchronized to be coincidental. "Look here," he said, pointing to a timeline. The war in Ukraine began after a strange conclave in the Vatican. Shortly before, there were secret meetings with ambassadors from influential countries. And now, Israel. It all seems like a macabre dance. but it was the figures in the Vatican that worried me the most. Documents found mentioned a man named Don Pietro Malvini. He was one of the Pope's closest advisors and known as the Black Pope among the Holy See's staff. At first I thought it was just a nickname due to his position as leader of the Jesuits. But the title seemed to have a more sinister meaning. With Irina's help, I gained access to a restricted area of the Vatican's secret archives. It was a silent night, and our hands trembled as we glided through the marble galleries and dimly lit corridors. Irina led us to a room locked by codes and guarded by heavy security. Inside, we found texts detailing rituals performed by Lux Obscura. They were strange rituals, described as spiritual alignments to open portals that would unite the physical and spiritual worlds. One word appeared repeatedly: Regis Tenebrarum, the King of Darkness. Among the texts, one document described the power structure of Lux Obscura. The Black Pope was the supreme leader, but he commanded cardinals, bishops, and even influential people in global positions of power. They were responsible for manipulating governments, creating religious divisions, and fostering conflicts. War was their tool, and the destruction of faith their ultimate goal. A symbol repeated in many of the texts caught our attention: an inverted triangle with a black cross in the center. Later, Lorenzo discovered that this symbol was also engraved in an underground chapel outside the Vatican, where the secret meetings of Lux Obscura were held. With each new step, the shadows began to follow us more closely. Lorenzo was the first to be attacked. One night, on his way home, he was surrounded by two men who threatened him with knives. He managed to escape, but his apartment was ransacked that same night. Irina also began to be followed. "They know we're meddling where we shouldn't," she said, as she locked the doors of her house. I, in turn, received a direct warning. A message was left in the hotel room where I was staying, a note with the words, "Go home," and a black cross drawn in dried blood. But the turning point was the disappearance of an informant. Father Anton, who promised to deliver more information about the Black Pope, vanished without a trace. Lorenzo found his name in a police report. His body was found days later, but the cause of death was never revealed. Despite the danger, we managed to decipher another passage from the secret texts. It described an event that Lux Obscura had awaited for centuries: the rise of a charismatic and powerful world leader who would unite the nations under a banner of false peace. This man would be the Antichrist, and the Vatican would be used as the stage for his spiritual coronation. "They are using the church as a tool," Irina whispered, shocked. "The faith that should unite people is being distorted to bring destruction." The connection between war and faith became evident. Lux Obscura was fostering global chaos so that people would lose their belief in God. Without faith, they would be vulnerable to accepting any leader who promised redemption, even if that leader were the King of Darkness himself. It was clear that time was running out. The wars in Ukraine and Israel would only be the beginning. Soon, something much bigger would shake the world, and Lux Obscura would be ready to seize the opportunity. We still had a chance to prevent the plan, but this mission would require us to confront the Black Pope himself and his forces. And we were far from being prepared for what was to come. We were running out of time and allies. Lorenzo, Irina, and I knew that if we remained idle, Lux Obscura's plans would advance unopposed. That's when Lorenzo brought a crucial clue. A clandestine meeting would be held in an underground chapel on the outskirts of Rome. "The source who gave me this died shortly after meeting me," said Lorenzo, his voice tense. "But he guaranteed that this event would be decisive. Don Malvini will be there, along with other elite members of the secret society. If we want definitive proof, it's now or never." My mind oscillated between fear and urgency. It was too dangerous, but if everything we had discovered was true, this meeting could confirm the extent of the Black Pope's plan. We decided to go. With Lorenzo using his journalistic skills to obtain access credentials and Irina providing a map of the underground chapel, we prepared our plan. Our objective was clear: to observe the ritual without being seen, find evidence, and escape before being discovered. The chapel was under a seemingly abandoned church, but as we approached, we saw luxury cars parked nearby. Inside, everything was silent, but the air seemed heavy, charged with something beyond the natural. We descended a narrow corridor lit by torches, the smell of incense mixed with burnt wax and dampness. At the end of the path, we hid behind a stone arch that gave a direct view of the main hall. The scene we witnessed was as surreal as it was terrifying. The underground chapel was decorated with inverted symbols, the black triangle with the cross in the center being the most predominant. About 30 figures, all dressed in black robes, stood silently, forming a circle around a stone altar. In the center, Dom Pietro Malvini, the Black Pope, wore a robe embroidered with ancient runes. He held a book whose cover seemed to be made of aged leather, and his voice echoed through the space as he read in an unknown language, which sounded more like a somber chant than human words. As the chant progressed, Malvini extended his hands, and the faithful gathered to repeat a phrase in unison: Adventus Regis Tenebrarum, Fiat Lux in Tenebris, the arrival of the King of Darkness. Let light shine in darkness. The meaning became clear when Malvini began to explain what was to come. Although he spoke in a ceremonial tone, his words were terribly direct. The nations are at war, and the chosen ones divided. Every conflict, every crisis, every doubt sown in faith is a step towards our triumph. Chaos will give way to order, but it will be a new order ruled by our King. He is already among us. We are paving the way for his coronation. My muscles tensed. This was the moment I had dreaded. The Dark King he'd mentioned was the Antichrist. According to the scriptures Malvini cited, the Antichrist's ascension wouldn't be merely political or social, but spiritual, with the Vatican as the stage for his coronation. Malvini continued, "The true Pope is already under our control. He is a pawn moved by our hands. When the time comes, he will make the announcement and surrender the throne to our King." His words were a blow to my faith. The idea that the Holy Father could be manipulated by the forces of darkness was something I had never considered possible. As the ritual continued, I felt an invisible force pulling me. It wasn't physical, but spiritual. I was overcome by a vision so intense, it felt like my soul had left my body. I saw the world in flames. Cities were destroyed by bombs while people cried for help in vain. Markets were empty and despair had consumed humanity. At the center of it all, I saw a man. He was charismatic, with a hypnotic gaze, and crowds followed him as if he were the answer to all their woes. But I knew who he was. He wasn't a savior. He was the Antichrist. Behind him, in the background, was Malvini, dressed as a pontiff, crowning him with a tiara adorned with demonic symbols. The Vatican had become the throne of evil. The vision was interrupted by Lorenzo pulling me by the arm. "Epaminondas, we need to leave now. They'll discover us." My heart was racing, but my legs felt like lead. Everything we had feared was before us. They were close to achieving their goals, and we were few against something so vast. Before we could leave, the silence was broken. One of the guards had noticed our presence. "There!" he shouted, and chaos ensued. We ran through the corridors as the footsteps of our pursuers echoed behind us. Lorenzo was in front, leading the way, but in a moment of distraction, he stumbled and fell. "Go! I'll hold them off." Courageously, Lorenzo pulled out a small knife he carried. "No!" I tried to dissuade him, but Irina pulled me by the arm. He knows what he's doing. If we stay, we'll all die. With tears in my eyes, I left Lorenzo behind, hearing his screams as he faced our pursuers. It was his sacrifice that allowed us to escape. We managed to emerge from the catacombs alive, but wounded, both physically and spiritually. Lorenzo had fallen, but we had seen what we needed to see. The Black Pope was real. Lux Obscura was in complete control of parts of the Vatican, and the arrival of the Antichrist was imminent. We felt the weight of the truth upon us. With the vision I had and what we witnessed, it was clear there was no more time. The spiritual and physical battle was about to begin, and the world had no idea what was about to happen. After escaping the underground chapel, Irina and I hid in a small apartment indicated by Lorenzo in the Trastevere neighborhood. The place was modest, with simple furniture and windows protected by heavy curtains. There, surrounded by the silence of the early morning, we began to organize what we had discovered. Lorenzo's sacrifice weighed heavily on our consciences, but we couldn't afford to hesitate. His death needed to mean something. We gathered our records, copied documents, recordings Lorenzo managed with a hidden recorder, and notes made of what we witnessed in the chapel. Everything necessary was transformed into a clear and urgent report. If we die, Epaminondas, the world needs to know what we discovered, Irina said, her voice trembling. I knew she was right. The little time we had left should be used to reveal the truth, even if it were the last thing we did. For 3 days, almost without rest, we compiled our findings into a manuscript. Each word was chosen carefully, not only to expose the secrets of Lux Obscura, but also to warn humanity about the imminent arrival of the Antichrist. I wrote about the Black Pope, his manipulations within the Vatican, and the plan to use global chaos as a tool to demoralize faith. We connected the wars in Ukraine and Israel, the growing polarization between nations, and even the scandals within the church, showing how everything was part of an orchestrated scheme. But what worried me most was what I had witnessed in the vision. I dedicated an entire chapter to describing the apocalyptic images that invaded my mind. The world in flames, crowds deceived by the Antichrist's charisma, and the Vatican transformed into the stage of his coronation. Do you think people will believe it? Irina asked as she reviewed the text. Maybe not now, I replied, but when the signs are clear, perhaps these words will help them resist. On the morning of the 4th day, Irina went out to get supplies. I asked her to be discreet and avoid crowded places, but she didn't return. I waited for hours, looking out the window, until I finally received a message on my phone. It was a picture of Irina, tied up and with terrified eyes. Below, a single sentence. If you don't stop, she'll be next. They found Irina. My heart despaired, but I knew that if I backed down, Lorenzo's sacrifice would have been in vain, and that they would never let us leave alive after so much information we had. With tears in my eyes, I said a silent prayer and continued working on the manuscript. With the manuscript complete, I used Lorenzo's connections to send it to various contacts around the world. Independent journalists, theologians, investigators, anyone who could help spread the message received a copy. I knew that Lux Obscura would try to silence everything, but I hoped that by spreading the material to many, at least some parts of the truth would survive. It didn't take long for the reprisals to begin. My means of communication were blocked, my location was exposed, and men came to patrol the apartment. There was no more safety. On the night before my escape, I recorded a video message addressed to whoever might find it. In the video, I explained who I was, what had been discovered, and the dangers the world would face. I ended with a warning. If you're watching this, know that the Antichrist is among us. Don't be deceived by his appearance or his promises of peace. He doesn't come to save, but to destroy. Remember these words and fight against the darkness with all the faith you have left. I saved the video on multiple devices and sent it along with the manuscript to several allies before destroying my computer and phone. I knew I couldn't stay in Rome. Using false documents that Lorenzo had provided before his death, I left the city. As I boarded a night train heading to the Italian countryside, I looked out the window and felt a mixture of emptiness and sadness. I had done everything I could, but I knew my fight was far from over. A few weeks later, in a remote village, I heard news about the manuscript. Most of the major media outlets ignored it or ridiculed it as an absurd conspiracy theory. However, small groups gathered to discuss its content. Blogs and religious forums posted important excerpts, and the message was to prepare for what we believed to be the end times. Even so, Lux Obscura acted quickly to discredit my story. Claims that the manuscript was a fraud or that I was mentally disturbed spread. Many, upon reading my story, dismissed it as fiction. Today, I am hiding in a cabin in the mountains, and I feel my time is running out. My body is tired, but my soul remains firm. Every day, the signs of the prophecies become clearer, more conflicts, more divisions, more despair. As I write these last words, I hear on the radio reports of a new leader emerging on the global scene. He speaks of peace, reconciliation, and unity, and the crowds hail him as a savior. My heart aches, for I know who he really is. The battle has begun, and although my strength is fading, my faith remains intact. Now it is up to the world to listen, fight, and resist. May God have mercy on us all.